Stacy, of course, is the biographer of Vera Nabokov, a book that won the Pulitzer Prize and my heart. She is a finalist for the Pulitzer, an outrage, for her biography of Saint-Exupéry. She wrote another book on Benjamin Franklin's experience in France and how it helped create America. Maybe her most daring book in a certain research sense, which we can discuss, is the biography of Cleopatra, a remarkable work, and most recently her book, The Witches, which both in its opening scared me to death and enthralled me. It's an extraordinary series of books. And Judith Thurman, who's been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2000, thankfully, and the collection of her work at The New Yorker is a book called Cleopatra's Nose, 39 Varieties of Desire. She once described herself as the sex correspondent of The New Yorker. I really don't know what she meant by that, but I think it's a great thing because that should get a lot of traffic on the internet. She won the National Book Award for her remarkable book on Isak Dinesen, a book for which she just had to go out and learn Danish, which is the kind of thing that biographers do, which is why I don't write them. And more recently, her biography of Colette, Secrets of the Flesh, led me and many, many other readers back to that, I think, really overlooked, underrated writer of fiction, which was an ancillary gift to the book, to Judith's book itself. Her book on Isak Dinesen, of course, was the foundation for Meryl Streep's greatest moment in Out of Africa. So, both of you come to your literary lives with lots of skills, lots of interests, a passionate reading of all kinds of things. Why did you become biographers? Why did you choose this genre instead of writing novels, only essays, or histories, or anything else that you could have done? Why biography? Maybe start with Stacy.
I think that probably those of us in this room are the only people out there not writing memoirs. And I'm assuming there might be a reason for that. I think initially, on my part, it was, no one ever sits on the stoop as a kid and says, I want to be a biographer when I grow up. At least I haven't met that person yet. And I think initially, to me, the idea of crawling into someone else's skin was very appealing, but so was the idea of writing history from a more intimate perspective, and of writing a book that had a very clear beginning, middle, and an end, which for a neophyte was a very attractive concept. I obviously had no idea what I was getting myself into. I'd rather be the sex correspondent for pretty much any magazine. So.
We can have two.
We talk now.
Exactly. I think we can have two. And how did you, let's stick with Stacy for a second, how did you, what was your ulterior motive for choosing the first subject that you did?
Well, the ulterior motive was to get out of publishing as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
No.
You were working in publishing, and then you were telling me out in the lobby as we were sucking down on our coffees that you also were excerpting books for the New York Post.
Yeah, David has just outed me.
Yeah.
I couldn't pay the rent on my publishing salary, so on the weekends I excerpted the most salacious books the New York Post could find for their 5-day-a-week excerpts, which you told me they're still doing.
They still do, yes.
So like Frank Sinatra throwing people into windows was a choice excerpt.
Right.
It was those kind, which does prepare one for a life of writing biography, I must say.
They just did the Tiger Woods last
They
week.
did? See, there you go.
It's
So
very,
we should all be sending our books their way, obviously. What was the question? Was there a question in there somewhere?
It's early, we're getting started. How did you come to write Vera?
Vera,
No.
sorry. Vera, I had after, and this is a perversity of mine, which I think most of us don't share, I didn't want to write the same book twice. I didn't want to write about another French figure with an unpronounceable name, although La Rochefoucauld or Brillat-Savarin were great ideas. But I did want to write a book with a different form. So the idea of writing a joint portrait of some kind was high on my list, and I had been a sort of Nabokov freak in college. So every time I went back to Nabokov, I was struck by the fact that there was this gaping hole at the center of the two very good biographies of him, and that was the hole that Vera had left, and she had essentially kept those biographers, all of them had been men at bay, and they had written that there was a hole at the center of Nabokov's biography, and there always would be. And that always would be was kind of a red flag to me.
And what was the barrier to writing Vera's life?
It was a trade-off, which many of you know well, of I will give you the papers as long as you leave me out of the picture. And that was really Vera's life work, was to keep herself off the page. And we can talk about this later, but the trouble with that book was she would correct a set of proofs, for example. This was one of the best pieces of material I had. I had the corrected proofs of Andrew Field's, I think, 1977 biography of Nabokov, and Vera had corrected the proofs because she felt Andrew had been a miserable scholar and made a lot of mistakes, and then she'd erased all her corrections, so nobody could really see them, unless, of course, you held them up to the light on a very sunny Swiss day, and there you could see what she had corrected. And some of the corrections were to the point where the final prose made no sense, like her explanation for why Nabokov had Vera in the classroom every day at Cornell was because he likes to see faces when he lectures. That makes no sense. But what Andrew had originally written and she had changed was he likes to see his wife's face as he lectures, and she had crossed that out. So,
Judith, same question. How did you come to biography and well, start with that.
Well, I just sort of do what people tell me to do.
I so doubt that.
I started out as a poet, and then when I came back from Europe in the 70s, I started writing for Ms. Magazine because I speak a few languages, and I knew about all of these women writers who had been either not translated or weren't known or lost women. So I started writing about that for Ms., and one of the women was Dinesen. Now, she wasn't completely unknown, but
What's the state of her reputation at the time?
Well, she had been...
What's the year, Judith?
That I wrote about it,
That
or
you
that
started
she...
to
It was the
conceive this?
mid-'70s.
Okay.
So she had, in the late 50s, she'd come to New York and had a kind of big, splashy American welcome, and she was on television. But then her work had sort of lapsed into obscurity. People weren't reading her. Gloria Steinem loved Dinesen, and so she asked me to write about her. And the only piece of writing in my entire life that just came to me with no torture was a little portrait that I invented, an old Danish countess, and I made her the narrator. I somehow, I don't know why, it was very...
You met her, didn't meet her for this?
No, I had never met her. She was dead.
She's gone. So that's a good reason.
Dead was good.
Always an obstacle, yeah.
Yeah. And so a young editor who had been at the University of Chicago with Hannah Arendt, who Arendt loved Dinesen, and he had wanted to publish a biography. He found me somehow, and we had dinner, and he tried to talk me into writing a biography. I told him he was crazy. I'd never written anything longer than 2,000 words. And he persisted, and eventually, trying to put him off, I said, well, I would need to be paid. It hadn't occurred to me that you actually... He said, well, how much would you need? And I thought, well, I'm just going to say...
You thought you were going to do this for nothing?
No. I just thought I'll say the largest amount of money that I can think of, and then this will be over. I said, I would need $10,000.
Good.
That was it. That's how I did it. That's how I got into it.
You're a rough negotiator. So, at what point do you realize I have to learn Danish, I have to do this, there are archives that are up to the ceiling, this is going to take me, this is not going to be a year's project, this is a monumental task. When you see the field in front of you, how long does that take, and what does that involve?
Well, I was sort of protected by my complete and total ignorance when I started. I had no idea.
The biographical side.
Right. I had no idea. I'd never gone to graduate school. I didn't know how to do a footnote, and I just waded into it. And so it was just wading deeper and deeper, like sort of one of those coastlines where it's very, very shallow and very, very shallow, and then so. I had no idea, is what.
Do you, to both of you, do you want your subjects dead? In other words, let me put that a different way. Is there any advantage whatsoever to having a living subject?
Is it fair to turn that question around to you? Because you've actually written about living people, unlike...
Well, I have, and neither one of them were very helpful. Muhammad Ali was sick and overwritten about, and Barack Obama I got 45 minutes with. So at that point, so it really wasn't all that helpful.
You spent time with Muhammad Ali, right? I mean, there was the sense of...
At this point, he was, he had what my father had, which was late Parkinson's, and it wasn't all that helpful. It was, and that book's not a biography. It's just not there's no box 6, aisle 7. It's
Right,
just,
right.
it's an entirely different thing. It's not scholarly at all. So the question really is to you. Try.
Good try.
Yeah, we'll talk about the Obamas later. It's hard for me. I feel like there should be a clinical distance to some extent, and that's perhaps wrong-headed and maybe just shyness speaking, but I feel as if there's a sort of Heisenberg uncertainty principle for biographers, and my being in the room with the subject is going to somehow change the temperature of things. And I do think, I'm thinking, there's this wonderful quote of Ben Franklin's that some of you may know about, 3 can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. And I do feel like the material comes out later, and people are willing to talk later, and that there is some advantage in time in terms of both archives and perspective.
Mm-hmm. Judith, would you have liked to have had conversations with Colette or?
Oh, I didn't say I didn't have conversations with them, by the way.
Yeah, right.
No, you have them in your head anyway. No, for me, death is the perspective. The idea of of writing an unfinished life is very daunting. I wouldn't want to do that, and I've turned down living subjects.
For example?
Philip.
Philip Roth.
Yeah.
So right now, we were on this, I think this very stage.
Yes.
At another cabaret night, talking about Philip Roth and biographer, and we were sitting with Philip Roth's biographer. Did you envy him or not envy him his task?
Well, I always knew he was
I ask because Philip Roth's biographer,
Blake.
Blake Bailey, had what I can't imagine many biographers have experienced. The subject, toward the end of his life, still extraordinarily lucid, basically, instead of writing another book, helping the biographer write his book. Now, levels of manipulation may be at work here, and I think you see that in Exit Ghost. But not only does he hand him all his papers, which are immense, he does daily interviews with him, and they go book by book, year by year. And then the subject does him the great courtesy of dying.
Right.
I say that not to be just a friend to us, but it couldn't be more ideal. Do you envy that, not with Philip, who's a dear friend of yours, but in general as a biographer's position?
Yes, but I always figured that Blake was going to wait till Philip died to publish it. I didn't think there was any way he was going to publish it before he died, because he was grateful. He was overwhelmed and grateful for all of this material and the help, and he was also wary of it, as he should have been. And to have, so I think he both had and contrived the best of both worlds in that respect.
Could you write a biography, either one of you, of somebody you despised?
I think it would be hard to spend 5 years with someone I despised. No, I think not. At one point, I thought about writing about Groucho Marx, who sues his children, and I found that a little odious, so I retreated. So no, I do think I don't think love is in the picture, but I think you have to at least like and/or admire your subject.
How does your emotional temperature toward the subject change as the research goes on?
That's a gigantic question, actually, because for me, it's a process of. It's very much like it's a process of separation. I was asked when the Dinesen book came out if I identified with my subject. That's another question that is sort of very difficult to answer in 2 sentences. You have to achieve detachment, and you have passionate feelings, both negative and positive, and they're both dangerous. And so the ideal is a sort of emotional detachment from the subject, in which you see you're not inside of this person. You can see them from the outside, and you can circumnavigate them, and that just takes time. My feelings about Colette changed in the course of the 8 years.
Describe that.
Yes, well, there were many things I absolutely loathed about her as I discovered them. I didn't know going into it that I.
Like what?
Well, she was an awful mother. She was extremely self-centered and selfish. Her mother said, "There's only one person in the world you can rely upon, and that's yourself." And she took that to heart, and it motored her exceptionally productive life as a writer, and got her through all kinds of great difficulties. But She was in some ways a tight-fisted, ungenerous a woman who was very rivalrous. And there was a rivalry with us. I felt that, I'm sure she was dead, but nevertheless, I felt that you cannot know me. You know, it's like you. Dennison, I felt, was someone who plunged the sword into the stone, and she was waiting for the champion to come along who could draw it out, the stone of understanding, the sword of understanding her. And Colette did not want to be known. So that was the struggle. And
Stacy, same question.
Yeah, it's funny. I think there almost should be, there's like the subject who resists you brings out something different in the biographer. And for me, the resisting subject obviously was Vera Nabokov, in the sense that she had put up every possible roadblock to anybody turning up any of the traces that she had left behind.
Could she sense you coming, you generically?
I don't think she ever sensed that anyone was going to come for her. I just felt that she always wanted to efface herself because it magnified the effect on her, because it took away from the effect of Vladimir's glory. But to the extent where, I mean, the denials were extraordinary. I mean, people who asked her how the two of them, the only two people who ever seemed to have dared to ask how the two of them had met, one of them was told, "I don't remember," and the second one was told, "Who are you, the KGB?" I mean, there just was no one was going to get any traction with this woman. And it came down to even denials of things that everyone knew to be true. I mean, she would say the Nabokov's son, Dmitri, was a race car driver and a Ferrari enthusiast, and he drove like the wind. And Vera would say, "I was never really worried about driving with Dmitri." Well, I've driven with Dmitri. No mother was not worried about driving with Dmitri. I mean, it just categorically untrue. Nabokov had an affair in the 1930s, which Vera denied until she discovered that some letters written to that woman existed, at which point she relented. But then she did this extraordinary thing when it was 1937, late in the middle of the year, and when Nabokov's correspondence was published and Vera was asked to pick a couple of personal letters, she just happened to pick a couple of personal letters from that summer. I mean, just there was this amazing,
It's as if the subject can hear the biographer coming.
flapping around in the distance, yeah.
And John Updike tried to deal with biography by doing it himself. He wrote Self-Consciousness, as if to get the job away. Then, very soon after he dies, Adam Begley comes along to do the biography, and Martha Updike puts up as many walls as possible. I mean, Philip Roth befriends a guy named Ross Miller, becomes his close friend, basically hires him as a biographer, then they rejects him. You can hear the biographer coming.
Well, the best is Thomas Hardy, who writes his own biography but publishes it under his wife's name. That's got to be the best.
Genius.
Genius. I'm doing that, exactly.
Yeah. Do you see, when you're going through box 8, aisle 9, do you see, this is a phenomenon that I envy in real biographers. They're in it's 10 o'clock in the morning, or at the University of Texas archive or wherever it is, and you find a letter, and somehow life blooms out of it.
yeah, that happens.
Tell me about that.
Once every 10 years.
Every 10 years, yeah. Well, the Dennison archives were an exception, a one-time only. I was doing the research in the 70s.
Where is this?
They were at the Royal Library in Copenhagen, and they hadn't been archived. It was just boxes of stuff. All through the way my basement is.
Out of order in Danish.
Out of order, mostly in Danish.
That's great.
Huge boxes, and then once it took 2 years to get access to them. And once I did, every morning in my carrel, they would deliver these boxes. It was like cleaning out your basement. And so I didn't know what was in them, or no one had read them. No one had been through them. And I remember that there was a telegram, going through them, there was a telegram from Dennis Van Chatten to Dennison that said, "Sorry about Daniel, wish I could do otherwise, blah, 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 love Dennis." And it referred to a pregnancy, and it referred to a child that she either thought she was pregnant or was pregnant and lost the child. And he was saying, "I can't do this." And there it was. There was this sort of extraordinary, it was the kind of key to a larger puzzle about them and about him and about her and her illness and this and that. And I remember finding the telegram and thinking, and there were many, many things in there. There were that fell into place. It's mostly in letters that it happens rather than in manuscripts.
And do you begin to feel and I could easily ask anyone here who does the work, that archives are more trustworthy than people.
Definitely, I think people are completely untrustworthy. I'm untrustworthy. To myself, I mean, each of us is an unreliable narrator.
But does that mean we never lie in letters or diaries or
Yes,
journals?
we do, but it's cumulative somehow. The evidence is
You
cumulative.
trust the paper more than you would trust interviews or oral history or the like.
It's the mass of material that you turn up. It's Rashomon. You have 5 different stories from 5 different people, and then you have 50 letters around the same subject, and eventually you don't get to the truth. You approach it. You can't get to it.
Stacey, same question.
I mean, I have come to sometimes feel that the archives can lie. I just doubt everything. This is a really miserable business we're in, isn't it? There was a series of papers when, in his first years in New York during the war, Saint-Exupéry is living in New York as a foreign national. No one really knows which side he's on, and so needless to say, he's being trailed mercilessly around town by various then OSS people, all of whom are, I think, like 23-year-old Harvard grads who are submitting reports on his feelings to their superiors, and all of those things are preserved in the National Archives, and not a single detail in any of those is remotely accurate. Partly just because the situation of the French abroad during the early years of the war, before the U.S. enters the war, is so murky that very few people had figured out how to penetrate it, much less these young sleuths. So there was an enormous cache of material that was just plain wrong, as there was about Saint-Exupéry's then mistress, who was also being followed, who was then in Portugal. Much of it wrong, although very useful in getting her to talk. So, there was a whole series of documentation that was wrong. I'm more struck by what often you don't find and how completely telling that can be.
For example?
Often. Why is there no account really of Caesar in Egypt during his time with Cleopatra? Clearly that was something that no good Roman wanted anyone to remember, because that was the illicit moment, and the illicit part of Caesar's life. He shouldn't have been consorting with an Egyptian queen on foreign soil. He should have come home after the Alexandrian War. Why was he cavorting along the Nile with this woman with whom he has a child? Very little anywhere about those months.
Stacey, after X number of books...
There was no archive in that sense, I should
No, I mean, when I first heard that
when
you were
working
writing
from
that,
Cleopatra's Diaries,
didn't that seem, I don't mean to be silly about this, but that project of writing a biography of Cleopatra seems somewhere in between audacious and crazy.
Lunatic would be the word you're looking for, yeah.
Because of the archival situation, because of the vast amounts that we don't know and is unknowable. Why take that on?
My only defense is that Vera Nabokov felt the same way. That I felt for those years, and maybe that was just the time in which I was working. I guess that book came out in 1999. The idea of writing about a writer's wife, who was a wife, basically, seemed crazy.
What were the precedents for it?
Jean Strauss and Brenda Maddox. What am I forgetting? There weren't.
So Joyce, Adams, Alice Adams. What else? Or, James rather. And what else is there? That's it.
There must have been others, which I'm suddenly blanking on because of the early hour. Zelda, exactly. Nancy Milford, right, exactly. Yes, there was archival material, but I felt I was always having to justify. I felt it was a sort of wacky idea as well. Cleopatra was an idea I'd had for a long time, and I had hesitated because I didn't know how to do it. And I think initially I simply thought it wasn't a straight biography. It would turn into 6 scenes with Cleopatra, basically. And then as I began to work, and again, this was the miracle of archival material, if not necessarily her archive, it became clear to me that there were not only scenes, there was dialogue in Plutarch, there were scenes that could be established, and there were whole swaths of Alexandrian life that actually could be documented, that one could figure out what she did with her day, something I didn't think anyone had ever really thought about before. What did she do all day?
Right.
She reigned.
Yeah, she reigned, which, it takes up a lot of time.
Reigned and reigned.
Reigned all day. Right.
Yeah.
So I've had the feeling occasionally, even my, modest, excursions into whatever it is, journalism, I think it's more the description, that there has to be a point at which the journalist slash biographer cares more about a certain moment in someone's life than the person who actually lived it. And because of how hard fought it was to discover it. I'll give you an example. When I was writing about Obama, a lunatic project in too short a time, and if I had another year, it would have been half as long. But such was my
That's true of
particular
all books.
circumstances, but mine in particular, a big, messy, wet wash of a book. But nevertheless, what I did not delve into much were girlfriends. And because I knew my rivals in crime out there, David Marinus and others, were having more success with this. And I told myself, well, you know, I had girlfriends in high school too, but I don't really think about them much, and it didn't really have, you know, whatever happened in the backseat of a car in 1976 in Paramus, New Jersey, probably doesn't bear much on what little I'm doing now, you know, whatever journalistic work I'm doing now. Obama had an interview with David Marinus, and he always gave 45 minutes to every book writer that he thought was reasonably credible. David goes into the White House, the work of state stops. Marinus gets halfway through his interview and lets on that he knows about girlfriend X. Suddenly, the interview expands to 2 hours because Obama wants to know more about the girl, because he hasn't thought about this woman in a long time. Not because he's a horrible misogynist, but because life moves on, and maybe when you were your 18-year-old girlfriend. Marinus spent tremendous energy and time to get these facts. Are you ever, again, in aisle 3, box 14, thinking, I have worked so hard to find out about whether Isak Dinesen liked cornflakes or that it almost means more to you and your literary construction and scholarly construction of the figure than maybe even to the person herself?
Well, I think the person herself, I just discovered in my basement, I had a big flood, letters from my 20s, my parents' letters to me, mine to them, friends writing to me.
That you had forgotten completely.
Completely. I mean, I knew, maybe I remembered the letters that letters might have existed. The immediacy of the letter, reading it in 2019, that was written in 1972 or something, the sense of what happened and where I was and what I felt was obliterated. I had no memory of it. So of course it was more intense. It was a revelation. It was like being in an archive and finding the letters of a subject. So the subject herself, so you're in a privileged position reading something. I mean, with Colette, there were letters that from her youth, she died at 81, so she wouldn't have remembered writing these letters at 17 or 20 or 30, whatever. And there I am reading it as a grown-up and very intently. So I think in that sense, the emotion has faded for the person who had it, but it is revived for the biographer who discovers the material.
A somewhat related question. You've both done literary biographies. What's the relationship and how to analyze the literary work as opposed to the literary life led? How fair, unfair is it to take the novel as evidence of the life lived on Monday through Sunday?
I'm very loath to make that leap usually, and my problem is usually figuring out how you integrate a discussion of the work into the discussion of the life, because the two don't necessarily jive completely. There are exceptions to that, and I was lucky in the first book with Saint-Exupéry. Basically everything he writes is what we would now consider memoir, even if it's published as novel, to the point where some books were published in France as fiction and they're published in America as nonfiction. So there's really a confusion there, and everything is based on his experience. So you can read the life in the work, and the themes of the work are very consistent from book to book, including even The Little Prince, which you could read as nonfiction in some ways. So there I was on more solid ground. With Nabokov, there are a couple of cases where you have crossover, and it gets complicated when, for example, the people who knew Nabokov best, from Nina Berberova to most of the Russian expatriate community, all said that they felt his novel, The Gift, was closer to a legitimate memoir than Speak Memory, his memoir. So, are you then allowed to read The Gift as it is a telling book about Nabokov's life? And that was particularly important to me because it is a book that contains a lot of Vera, thinly disguised, and it is written at a point of crisis in the marriage where he's clearly writing his way back into the marriage, and you can see that in the novel. He's at the same time that he's writing this amazing paean to marriage, assuring his mistress that he's writing, that he's going to get out of this situation, and he's writing faithlessly about faithfulness. So, there's clearly a moment there where the two cross roads, but I otherwise would sort of veer from that. To your earlier point about how hard you work to find something, I think we've all had this, where when you had to go into that flea-ridden garage, 3,000 miles from home to get a document, you're going to use that document whether it belongs in the book or not. There is definitely something about the amount of struggle it took to obtain and how really, salient it's going to be to the text. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I remember writing about Out of Africa when I got to that chapter, that all books take place at the moment they are written, and for the writers. So I think you of course cannot treat anything as autofiction. Everything has been destroyed, even one's own letters, email. This is why we were saying documents, what are supposedly letters written in the moment, they can lie just as well as anything else. But you're encoding, the work comes out of you. The work comes out of the immediate experience, what's happening to you then, what's happened to you in the past. So you can look for evidence of the mind, of the feelings, of the past, of the social history of every work of fiction or nonfiction. I think it's legitimate to use the work in that way, not to peg, the work is not a series of hooks that you can hang things on. So, but there's definitely, Colette was extraordinarily vehement about no one should use the writer's work to interpret the life. And and
well advised, right?
Yes. And she actually sued to have some letters of hers that came up for sale blocked, and she lost. And they're in the.
What's the story behind that?
They're in the Bibliothèque Nationale. They were letters that she'd written as a young woman to Robert de Montesquieu, who was a flamboyant figure of the fin de siècle. And he was gay, but they were very flirtatious and sort of provocative and silly, and posing and charming. And there was nothing terrible about them, especially from the point of view of the 1990s when I was looking at them. But she felt that this was a terrible invasion of a writer's privacy to have any personal correspondence in public or even in sort of archival hands. That was how she felt about it.
In the biographers, well, novelists all have not only novels that they read and that feed them and shape their lives, they also have models for what they want to do, novels that they see as, if I could only do that, then I would be achieving something. In the art of biography, who is that and what is that for you, Stacy?
It changes for me. I think always and at all times, Richard Ellman's work generally. When I was writing my first book, it was two odd books. It was James Mello, Charmed Circle. Has anyone else even read that book? And Justin. Alan Judd's Ford Maddox Ford biography, a book I'm sure only his mother and I read, which has no footnotes. And it's just a beautifully novelistic account of a life. And somehow, when writing my first book, those were the touchstones. Leon Adele's book about how to write a biography on writing lives was obviously of huge help. And there's a steady diet of Strachey and Holmes and a couple of other, Judith Thurman, David Remnick. But those were the mainstays. It interestingly changes over time, and the search for a model for a book to kind of hold to while I'm working is important. It's always been important, and it was particularly vexing when I was working on Cleopatra, because I thought I was doing something different, and I wasn't sure what it was, but I figured someone else had done it. And I kept reaching toward books by books about subjects where there was little information, like Shakespeare and Jane Austen, and finally I settled on Jack Miles, because I figured I must know more about Cleopatra than he knew about God, right? But that wasn't what I wanted to do either, and so I didn't have a model, and that was actually really difficult to be on terrain where I didn't feel like anyone had kind of done this before. So I'm much more comfortable when there's a book or a couple of books on the shelf that I can pull down regularly. Nancy Mitford's books, I'm afraid I do. That's my junk food, yeah.
That's your junk food. I'm reading the
Listen,
New York Post,
I
and you're
used to-
reading Nancy Mitford, and that's
Excuse me,
your
you're
junk
reading
food.
my work in the New York Post, okay? So please.
Not anymore, sadly. Good.
I had no idea, as I say, how to organize a big narrative. The longest thing I'd written was 2,000 words. So Leon Nadell was my master
On Henry James.
on Henry James, the 4-volume Henry James, because I thought I didn't know how to write a book. So I was like, books, chapters, right? So you have to write chapters. You can't do a biography in chapters. It's too big a unit. And I only realized that reading Nadell. And he has these short sections which are numbered. I love those little numbered sections. And in the span of a chapter, where you cover a lot of ground, and if you do it in little numbered sections, even as you're writing it and organizing it, you can link them up and give them a shape, and an enormous narrative then begins to emerge. And I learned that from him. I later on the sheer brilliance of Graham Robb's prose style, his biography of Rimbaud, again, another completely mysterious. He's sort of Cleopatra-like Rimbaud. There's a lot about his youth in France, but the rest of his life when he disappears and becomes probably a slave trader. And Rob he found new things, and then he sort of did that brilliantly. But it was the prose, the sentences. And writing beautiful sentences for the length of 500 or 600 or 700 pages is something that I admire very much. And then Richard Holmes, who's one of the most innovative, I think, and important biographers of my generation. They were all sort of my masters.
There's been a lot of for a long time, obviously, writing about biography and questions of biography. And Janet Malcolm's book about Sylvia Plath certainly got into a lot of these questions. What's your reaction to those kind of theoretical and ethical proddings about the biographer's art? Talking about
In terms of the biographer as trespasser? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think that we're all trespassing to some extent. I mean, would any of us want a biography written about us? God, no, right? That's why we're all burning our papers when we get home tonight. So yeah, I mean, I do see it as trespass. I also see it as a responsibility to history. So it doesn't, and I think the two, where those balance each other out is pretty clear to me. I think part of her interviewer's bargain with subject, I do buy into, and that may explain to some extent my hesitation to working on a living subject. When you were talking about playing interviews, Obama and his interest in the previous girlfriend, I was thinking about a problem I had with the Saint-Exupéry book with the longtime girlfriend, who was really the steadiest force in Saint-Ex's life, who was living in France with him for several years, although he was married to someone else, and then stays in France during the war when he comes to America and settles in with a absolutely fabulous, charismatic young American woman in whose apartment he writes The Little Prince, and whom I also interviewed. And when I said to the French mistress that I had met the American mistress, our relationship changed substantially. And she was all questions, interestingly, and what was Sylvia doing now? And the best line, of course, was, "Oh, Sylvia, I hear she has terrible legs." And interestingly, and this had been said before, the two women looked shockingly alike, which was even clearer when they were both in their 80s. Tall, blonde, and titled was how he liked his women, and that was sort of true. But, you know, so I could see that I was playing a game that I didn't really necessarily mean to be playing, but that wasn't entirely fair. And that may be why I then wrote about someone who was very dead next, so I didn't have to interview Ben Franklin's girlfriends.
There are many adjectives that reviewers have for even the best biographies. Magisterial usually means very long. The other is a more elusive, odd term. It's definitive. What does that mean? Is it a legitimate term? Is anything definitive for very long? I'm sure Leon Nadel's biography of James or Ellman's of Joyce or Wilde are termed definitive in this review and that. Are they, in fact, definitive?
No, it's a semicolon.
Yeah, I
Well,
mean,
could you elaborate a little bit?
Oh.
on that? Yeah. And by the way,
before I say it's a comma.
By the way, even you people that are hiding in the back, I see you. We're going to get. We'll have a few minutes for questions to Judith and Stacy. So we'll finish with this question.
No, I think every generation gets a go at the great figures, at the controversial figures, at the beloved figures, and maybe more than once in a generation. It depends how you count the generation, 15 years. So no, it's open, and because you see, you'll reinterpret a life with, there's more material, there's less material, or the person is suddenly relevant to the person. No, nothing's definitive, absolutely nothing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think I felt this particularly when I went back. At some point, I went back and stupidly, I don't know how you all do this with the earlier biographies, but I stupidly read some of the earlier Cleopatra biographies. There are a lot of Cleopatra biographies, but I read some of what were the best.
Stupidly?
Don't usually
isn't it
read
obligatory?
those. I don't usually read the other biographers.
You don't? Oh.
No, I just go back, insofar as it's possible, I usually go back to the primary sources and I will read secondary sources on the supporting cast, but I otherwise don't, I try not to. I think that's early on, Joe Ellis, I think, said to me that there was like a Bermuda Triangle and you could get lost there, and I thought that sound advice.
But he's dealing always with those founding fathers of whom and you have too, but you've also written about people that there aren't biographies, or if there are, they're scant.
Right, I mean, certainly in Vera's case, there were
Yeah.
like 6 lines on the page about
And lots of dedications.
about her. But when I did go, lots of dedications. Nicholson Baker once said it was a nervous tick with Nabokov that every book was dedicated to Vera.
Or fear.
Yeah, or there's one book that was dedicated to his mother in Russian and Vera in English. That's hedging your bets. When I went back to read those earlier biographies of Cleopatra, it was interesting to see how often people would say, you know, she waged war, she ran the economy, she controlled the Navy, but she was just a girl. And, you know, obviously I was writing at a very different time. And so it struck me, you know, really that we are, as much as we hate to think of ourselves as such, coming to these things from the perspective of the moment in which we write.
I just wanted to go back to the notion of trespassing. I in a New Yorker book review before your time was a roundup of biographies of Charlotte Bronte. The line came to me that biography is dirty-minded fidelity and fiction is high-minded betrayal. So I think that biography, I think it's a work of a handmaiden or hand servant and body servant in many respects, but I think it's a work of extraordinarily. People should be grateful to have someone. If they're dead, they can't be grateful. But I think it's a worthy enterprise. I'm not sure it's somewhat trespassing. But if you are a public figure or a writer, either destroy all your papers, or you can be sure that there will be a biography.
Is
If you destroy your papers, that's no guarantee. We're not coming
Well,
for
this
you.
is it. Is email in effect destroying papers because it's so easily obliterated? First of all, letters and emails are written in a different spirit and with a different voice. This is probably the most discussed or most banal question possible to raise at a biographers conference, but is email killing the art of biography?
Well, it's a daily record. It's people in the 19th century, 18th century, everybody wrote letters every day. That was how they communicated. So there was a mass, and a sort of wonderful mass of life documented on a daily basis. That's what email does. And growing up, I was not writing letters every day to people, to my far-flung friends. The telephone obliterated that to some degree. So email, in one sense, has restored it. If you go back 5 years and
Letters, once you've sent them, are all over the place. They can be collected. Emails can be gone dunk like that, and people don't save them with the same fealty and.
Gmail saves them. It depends what your server is, I guess.
And what kind of lawyer the biographer has. Okay, so questions. Raise your hand and then shout like the Dickens. Yes, sir.
I'm enjoying the panel. Thank you for coming this morning. My question goes along the lines of the trespass question. Have you ever felt like an imposter when you've taken on the topic of a biography?
should I repeat those questions? It's early in the morning and a hearing is at a minimum. So on the question of, well, have you ever felt like an imposter as you take on a subject?
Imposter syndrome, you know,
Yeah, who am I to take on this, you know, great woman or
Every
man?
single day and at this particular moment, yes.
I agree, every single day.
I mean, it's an enormously, when you think about it, it's a ridiculously hubristic enterprise, right? I'm now going to insert myself into someone else's life and somehow be able to speak for that person, right? I mean, it doesn't, you know, who gave you that, you know, where does your card come from? What union do you belong to? And how is that even possible? And moreover, you know, in the middle of the night thought of maybe I got it wrong, right? I mean, there's a letter that Vera Nabokov kept in her top desk drawer. I only know this because her top desk drawer was never unpacked, so I had her top desk drawer in a box. And it was a letter from someone she'd known many, many decades earlier in Berlin. And I assumed she kept for a reason in the top desk drawer. And it was about how beautiful she had looked when she was in her 20s. And, you know, 10 years after the book was published, I woke up in the middle of the night and thought, maybe she just didn't file it. You know, maybe there was no particular meaning to that one letter being in the top desk drawer. So if what you're asking for is the solution to how not to feel like an imposter, you might ask Judith or David, because I don't have it.
I always feel like an imposter for years, and then at a certain point, I realize I know more than anybody else about this subject, pretty much, depending on what the subject is. And it's in the case of Colette, in the case of Dennison, definitely, because I was the only one who had seen those archives in their entirety. And it was 7 years, and I couldn't tell you what I had done the day before, but I could tell you at any given point what she had done on a given day.
Exactly.
You start out by pretending, you start out by being a fraud, and then you sort of gain authority you earn the authority very slowly.
Next. Yes.
Stacey, you talked about being fascinated by what's not in the archives, and I'm wondering if you guys could talk about what it is to recover from absences or silences, how you draw meaning out of that, or
Sure. The question is figuring out what's not in the archives and how you draw conclusions from it. Is there an instance of that you can conjure on this Saturday morning?
Well, since I already spoke about the Vera one, Franklin writes an autobiography, which is, to me, the most cunning act of misdirection. I mean, so much of it is fiction that, I mean, I think we should all feel that way about autobiography generally. It's a great way to tell the truth about other people, but not necessarily about the subject. But he ends, first of all, it's this ode, as we all know, to diligence in industry, but he never finishes the book. So that's already, to me, very instructive. But for the end of the life, for the French mission, which is what I was writing about, the 8 years he spends in France, he basically, in his outline for the autobiography, writes to France, period, treaty, period, etc. And I felt like, well, I'm writing a book which is 400 pages, 400 pages about the etc. So I'm just going to explode that etc. as well as I can. He had a habit of writing angry letters and not mailing them. So the very fact that he was right, I mean, that he would write, that we think of him as a very equitable, temperate man. It's because he wrote the angry letter, but he didn't send it. So there was this level of restraint there that I thought one could read quite a lot into. I'm trying quickly to think of another example. As I said, the entire unwillingness of Roman writers to mention Caesar's time with Cleopatra. Cleopatra then goes to Rome to be with Julius Caesar, with their child. There are 4 lines in Cicero, and that's all we have, about the months that she would have spent in Rome, where she's living on one side of town and Caesar's wife is living on the other. She leaves in a hurry after Caesar's murder. And there's clearly, I mean, there's some cause and effect here, we just can't put our fingers on it. But from that complete veil of silence, I think a lot can be inferred, as I inferred as well from the fact that Vera had worked so hard to try to remove herself. I felt in all those protests she was saying a great deal.
I think yes.
Just a good word for biographies of living figures.
Uh-huh.
The evidence sometimes vanishes, people die. The biographer is doing it while the subject is alive. It also gives the subject a sporting chance to reply. It sometimes opens up things, subjects that aren't otherwise discussed.
Who was that by?
I don't remember I think it was a German writer, I don't remember the name.
Okay. You do? Oh, okay. Question. I think we have time for two more quickly. Yes.
Quick question, before novels. What are your current projects, and what is the current dilemma you're having with your current project?
Question is, if one should choose to answer it, what is your current project and what dilemma or dilemmas are you having in said project?
How much time do we have left?
We have 1 minute.
First, or-
Yeah, I have a current project. I can't talk about it, not because it's a big secret. It's gestating. It's too fragile inside of me still to talk about. It's a biography. It's not a conventional, it's not a sort of deep dive biography. It's something else. It'll probably, take me forever. And the problems I'm having with it are starting it, of jumping off the edge of the cliff. And there's tons of reading, and I'm trying to do it, and it's that awful beginning is the main problem at the moment.
We did talk about that, about where you start a book, because it's murder. I mean, that can go on for years. The knowing where to start can take years. I'm writing a biography of Samuel Adams, which is problematic in every possible respect, but partly I don't have a model for what I want to do, which is different. Partly I know this will all surprise you all, he's a very recessive figure who tried to cover his tracks. So uncovering
like
those
that.
tracks.
You like the covering the tracks.
It's time to admit I must like those people, yeah. That doesn't make it any easier. And how he does so and why he does so is part of this, becomes part of the narrative in some way.
Okay. Is there a final question?
We have 15
Yeah.
more minutes.
Oh, we do?
Oh, great.
Oh,
Okay.
my God. Nobody told me. I thought it was an hour, and I was being respectful. So we'll take some more. Go ahead. We'll do a few more.
That you had, or at least Judith Thurman said she turned down living subjects, and Stacy Schiff said that times the biographers read, etc. I was just interested in that because I had attended at the 92nd Street Y a few months ago something with Hermione Lee, where she said something very different, which is that she only takes on biographies and has only taken on biographies that she's been specifically asked or commissioned to do. I guess she was asked to do the Wolf biography by the Quentin Bell and Lucy Bell, and that she's now working on a Tom Stoppard biography, and she's been asked by him to do that. And I just thought that's so interesting, and it seems to me that that would present a number of complications to be, the commissioned or chosen one to do a biography, and particularly then with Stoppard on a living subject. And I
But there are commissions and these agreements, my understanding, if I can just, they're highly variable. They're highly variable. Who initiates it, who agrees to it, what the terms are. So again, we were on this stage not so long ago, and James Atlas was the moderator, which is talking about Philip Roth. And because he had done a biography of Delmore Schwartz, that circle of people saw him with favor. And so his idea initially, as I understand the story, and he wrote a very fine book about the writing of biography, and in fact, I think he would agree that it's a better book than what I'm about to discuss, is that he then got access to Saul Bellow, who, like many contemporary figures of a certain level of fame, is a reluctant subject but knows that the job is going to get done. So they try to find the right person and maybe someone where they can get their oar in at some point. So it was semi-authorized, and then everything went bad, which is to say the book, I think Jim, if he were sitting in this room, and maybe he is, would agree that if he was ever in love with Bellow, and certainly would have been the books, he fell out of love with Bellow for all kinds of personal reasons about his discoveries about Bellow's treatment of this one and that one. He came not to like Bellow in many ways, and that was evident in the final project. I think he struggled in the literary criticism part, and his distaste for certain aspects of Bellow as a subject became evident. So that's a way that one of those relationships can end in a result that's not so wonderful. Does anybody else want to?
Well, the whole notion of beholdenness is extremely dangerous. So beholdenness to the people who've commissioned you, that's easy. If the subject is dead and you're commissioned by the estate to do a biography, you can betray them, that's fine. You can just write the book you need to write.
This holds for journalism too. Michael Kinsley used to say that the best, as an editor, the best relationship is if the writer turns in the piece to the editor and then gets hit by a bus. As the writer of profiles, what one hopes for is that you get what you need from the profile subject, and then before you write it, the subject is hit by a bus. These are sadistic analogies, but I think we're doing it all in good fun. I just read a biography that's in galleys now of Susan Sontag, which is a complicated ball of wax. And I noted that one of my own writers, a wonderful, wonderful, scrupulous, honest writer, Joan Acocella, had done a profile for the magazine while I was editing it of Susan Sontag. It's very, very clear from Joan's own descriptions in this book, although I haven't asked her about it personally, and the book is, as they say endlessly now, problematic, that the Susan Sontag that Joan encountered was not entirely the Susan Sontag that appears on the page, that the piece was more purely admiring than what she was observing. Let's leave it at that. And I think there was a sense of, I don't know, I don't want to speak for Joan, whether she was to some degree intimidated by Susan Sontag or cowed or felt responsible toward her in ways that she didn't want to undermine by descriptions of her Sontag's arrogance or high-handedness in other ways. So that's a tricky interplay between journalist and subject, and I can only imagine that's the same for biographer as well. You all would speak to that too.
Well, the New Yorker profiles are extremely challenging for many, on many counts. They're mini biographies. If it's a writer, you have to read everything, and it's condensation, and the person herself, in my case, it's mostly women, whom I've profiled. So there is where the Janet Malcolm complex comes into play more than in biography.
Yeah, and I think old-fashioned-ish, like me, journalists don't want to ever have a relationship with that person afterwards because you feel that if you did, you didn't do your job, and if you don't, you hurt their feelings, so you just kind of wish they would go away. And that's very possible. I just did one on Buddy Guy, the blues guitarist, and I knew there was going to be no, he's 83, he lives in Chicago, he doesn't know from me, and really didn't care about this thing. But Philip Roth, it was unusual in that I got to know him, not like you, but somewhat, after writing a profile, and there was a certain professional, silly, possibly ambivalence about that development, although I treasured it.
I don't know. I've stayed friends with a number of my New Yorker profile subjects, and in several cases, they hated the profile initially, hated it.
Who?
Well, Vanessa Beecroft, she felt it was that, and I kept saying, Vanessa, this is on the record. She was just, you can call it off the record if you're telling me. And then she called back and she said she thought better of it. She said, I just, no, you got me. I'm really grateful for it. And we were friends for a while after that. And Rachel Cusk, who...
oh my God, she was, yeah.
Yeah, we had a screaming in the office. The checker was calling her about...
Particularly about her parents.
About her parents and the husband, the second husband. And then...
God, nobody ever likes me when it's over.
No,
so
but I think what happened was she didn't read it. She was so upset by the parents.
Bullshit. Yeah. Of course she read it. It's like all those novels say, I don't read those reviews. Then why do you seem to have memorized the Irving Howe review?
Well, if she read it, so we've seen each other since, and we're in touch. To my great surprise, because like you, I don't. The ideal is when you're done, you're done. But it does happen that, because it's an incredibly intimate bond, and some people...
You hear from Ben Franklin much?
All the time, actually. We're on very close terms. I actually just think people don't recognize themselves on the page. I mean, none of us would recognize
Why would
themselves,
they?
right?
Even if there's a very standard issue piece in the New York Times about the New Yorker. There are, and I recognize the conventions. There's the nice thing that always has to be counterbalanced by the vaguely hostile or shitty thing. I get that, but when it's about me, my feelings are hurt.
It's never a vaguely hostile thing. It's never a vaguely hostile thing.
Or it never seems to plumb the depth of human experience, whereas, I interviewed Bob Caro the other night, who's possibly spent more time, and I say this with unbelievable regard and affection, but more time thinking about Lyndon Johnson than Lyndon Johnson ever thought about Lyndon Johnson. And that's the
And
biographer's
Johnson
mania.
died in his 60s, so Caro spent more time on Lyndon Johnson than with the
Possibly.
life.
And it will never end. I mean, it is just the depths of his curiosity about everything. The smell of, West Texas or just anything is boundless. And that just seems to me both the beauty and the mania of what you all practice.
Judith, am I right? Did you wear your subject's perfume at one point?
No, and this is it's a perfect example. No. So when the Dennison book came out, it was a big success, blah, blah, blah. And Time magazine was doing a piece on literary biography because it was the new big genre. So they interviewed me and 5 other people, and I was this sort of newcomer and the youngest and blah, blah, blah. And the woman, this young woman, she had been assigned to find a biographer who identified with her subject. And all of her questions were, how did I identify? Well, I didn't really identify. And then finally, I wanted to give her something. I was sort of pleased to be interviewed for Time magazine. I said, well, I actually discovered that we wear the same, she wore and I wore, it's the same perfume, which was a sort of obscure at the time French perfume called Fracas. And it came out in Time magazine. Thurman identified with her subject so much that she wore the same perfume.
So the moral of the story is just never believe anything that you read in print,
Exactly.
right? Yeah.
Welcome to journalism.
Yeah.
I should have worn my glasses. There's a blue person over there. Yeah.
I just want to get back to the question about kind of inferring from the archives. So sometimes you get to this thing where there's tons of letters from like a 4-year period, and then there's
Nothing for, yeah.
archives that have been collected.
Yeah.
Tons of letters, one person got nothing. So just, probably and surely, but just I'm just wondering about some techniques that you have, just a surfeit of riches in one area and just not much.
So the question is for the people in the cheap seats up there. So what happens when you've got a surfeit of material from 1865 to 1869 and nothing for the 4 years before that and after? What do you do?
I guess as a rule of thumb, I think you go where the material takes you, and you just hope no one's going to notice. So for example, with Cleopatra, which is the obvious example here, there was no such thing as childhood in the ancient world, so there was no way I was going to be right about her favorite toys. However, it very early on became clear to me that Cleopatra's education had been precisely the same education because it was the classical education for any highborn person anywhere of any gender in the ancient world, was completely and in every respect the same as Julius Caesar's or Mark Antony's or anyone else who had been born in Athens or Greece or Alexandria, Athens or Rome or Alexandria. And I therefore knew precisely which books she read, in which order, how she learned to read them, when she declaimed them, how she learned to write her alphabet, and at what ages. So by using her education, I could kind of make it not obvious that I didn't know anything about her childhood. So what you have is the education of Cleopatra, but you don't have anything about her childhood. And I think you just thank goodness you have the riches that you have, and you hope that no one's going to notice where you had to comb over.
In that regard, there's a
Comb-over theory.
The comb-over theory of biography. It's fabulous.
Well, that book was like one giant comb over.
And by the way, comb-overs are never obvious.
Wait a minute. I didn't say toupees. I said comb overs,
Well, you
Mr.
remember Rudy
Remnick.
Giuliani's? Yeah.
There's another great biography that should be named J. Leida's Biography of Emily Dickinson, in which there's not a single word of Emily Dickinson's. The days and hours of Emily Dickinson, and he's a great collageist, a montage film theorist, and without having any letters from 1852 or 4 or 48 or whatever, he creates an incredibly dense sense of her life in context. It's the biography of a context of a life. So there are things you can do when you don't have documentation for a period in someone's life that is illustrated by that out of print. If there's any publishers here, please get that back.
It's also sometimes refreshing for the biographer to step to the lip of the stage and say, I don't care about X, Y, or Z. I just read George Packer, I read it a while ago, George Packer's book on Richard Holbrooke, which is, I think his friends, meaning me and a few others in the beginning when he was doing this, thought, George, no one's really, we counseled against it. It's a remarkable book in many ways because the figure is so outsized, bad and good, and impact on foreign policy and reflection of American foreign policy in the so-called American century and its eclipse is so emblematic. But at a certain point early in the book, basically George Packer says to the reader, let's just skip the childhood, shall we? Because it really has no great effect that I can see, except for point A, B, and C, on the book I really want to write. Just dispenses with it, knows all about it, and just decides we're not having it. It was a quite refreshing break from maybe this sort of standard operating. I think we have time for one more, and off we go. Yes? The question is about gender. Can you talk a little bit about the gender of the people you've written about and how that affects matters? I think that's largely it.
I've only written about women. So, but that's not to say that gender isn't a huge part of the writing about, and what is a woman? You know, it's also the question, and then especially with Colette, because she is the first person really, writer, and writes about it, to realize that gender is a bell curve, and that's what she's going to make of it, and that we're all somewhere on that curve. So that was her radicalism, very underestimated. But you have done both.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard because I'm inside that question to answer that question. I remember feeling very strongly about this, obviously, when I started the Nabokov book, and I talked to Brian Boyd, who had written the brilliant 2-volume biography of Nabokov, and I said I was working on a book about Vera, and he said, why would you do that? And to his point of view, he said his actual words were, there's no documentation. Vera wrote every letter that Vladimir sent after a certain year. That year was 30 years before he died, 40 years before he died. So there's plenty of documentation, in fact. So there was just a difference in perspective, and I was taking the carpet and turning it and looking at the other side. I mean, all those pictures we know of Nabokov sitting in his car in the middle of nowhere in Montana with a butterfly net next to him writing Lolita. Well, someone drove that car because he didn't drive. So, you know, it was very clear to me that someone was missing something, and that probably the person who was going to notice that was going to be a woman. Did being a woman have any bearing whatsoever on Franklin's years in France? No, it never got me into an archive, interestingly enough. It may have kept me out of archives. I mean, no, I don't think it did, and on the page I'm not sure it shows. So I kind of go back and forth. Do I wish that Samuel Adams were a woman? Yes, I wish she'd lived in 1930s Paris too, but you know, that's just me.
Stacy and Judith, thank you very much. Thank you.